everyone. As most of you know, I'm Alex Taylor, and I work for ArcaOS, among other things. So, as you know, most of you, for the last couple of years, I've been giving presentations on UEFI support in ArcaOS. And the last presentation I gave on this was only a few months ago, where I showed off the state of the new GPT disk support. Now, this support has been progressing steadily since then, so today I'm going to give you an updated look at what's new. First, some obligatory disclaimers. Uh, as I mentioned last time, if ArcaOS already works to your satisfaction on your current PC hardware, then you're not required to use UEFI and GPT support. ArcaOS 5.1 will continue to support the more traditional BIOS style of hardware, as long as your machine is capable of doing so. Next, UEFI and GPT support are just that. They're support for UEFI and GPT. Having that support doesn't necessarily eliminate other types of compatibility issues. So, again, as OS2 users, we're always going to have to be a bit more conscious about what kind of hardware we get for our systems. And third, all features, functionality, versioning, and release plans mentioned here are subject to change. These are forward-looking statements based only on ArcaOS's current internal roadmap, and they are not to be interpreted as promises or announcements. So that said, I'm going to recap some of the information in brief that I've covered before, but I'll try and go through it a bit more quickly. So I think most of you probably know the answer to this question now. What is UEFI? To recap, UEFI is a modern replacement for the old PC BIOS standard, which is much more flexible and sophisticated. As a standard, UEFI has been around for years, but it really became mainstream from around 2013 or so, which happens to have been when Microsoft released Windows 8. So UEFI isn't something that's new. That said, until recently, most computers and mainboards included something called a CSM, or Compatibility Support Module. This was basically a module that emulated the old BIOS interface on a UEFI-capable system. However, hardware manufacturers have now started phasing out CSM support in their newest computers and system boards. So, new computers increasingly require UEFI support in order to be usable. Intel, for example, officially ended CSM support on its systems as of early 2020. And this is where it becomes an important issue for OS2 users. With every month that goes by, it becomes harder to find new systems with old-style BIOS compatibility. Now, what are the technical implications of this? Well, OS2 uses a few BIOS services, mainly int10 for VGA hardware access and int13 for generic disk I/O. A large part of developing UEFI support for ArcaOS has involved circumventing these dependencies. Fortunately, there aren't too many of them. A slight side note here, one issue that we've seen over the past several years is various BIOS-based systems where DOS windowed sessions and seamless WinOS2 sessions don't work. You may have seen the message that says something like the system does not support this session's video mode in a window. And that was kind of an early symptom of the phasing out of classic BIOS support, where even with a CSM, the video BIOS didn't always provide the support that OS2 expected. As I noted in my last presentation, while it's still being worked on, the UEFI support in ArcaOS is quite solid already. We can boot from DVD or USB stick and from hard disk. High-resolution video support is working, although at present only the panorama driver is supported. DOS and WinOS2 support are working, including both full screen and windowed sessions. We have support for memory dumps on many types of disk, and we also have full color boot logos, which I have to say look a lot nicer than the old 16 color VGA logo. And DOS support under UEFI has also come a long way. A lot of DOS applications are running with good performance now, including a lot of games, which tend to push the limits of DOS harder than other applications. That's not to say that all games work. There have always been some issues with things that really push the limits of support, as has always been the case, even in the earliest days of OS 2. But our support is in pretty good shape right now, and it's getting better all the time. And one reason this is possible, referring specifically to the DOS support, is that our UEFI subsystem takes over the video services that full-screen DOS relies on, and which used to be provided by the BIOS. So this actually gives us a lot more control over that support, and therefore more consistency. So the days of seeing that the system does not support this video mode in a window message are hopefully moving behind us. Alright, moving on to GPT support. So what is GPT? It's short for GUID partition table, and similar to how UEFI is a replacement for traditional BIOS, GPT is a replacement for the MBR style disk layout. GPT is actually defined in the UEFI standard, although you can have UEFI without GPT and vice versa. Still, the default assumption of most hardware and software manufacturers is that UEFI and GPT will go together. From a technical standpoint, GPT supports hard disks larger than 2 terabytes. It eliminates the old cylinder head sector type of addressing, which gets rid of a host of geometry problems. Extended and logical partitions are a thing of the past, and disks can have as many as 128 partitions, or possibly even more. More to the point, most systems nowadays are shipped with disks formatted using GPT. Up until now, the only way for OS 2 users to deal with disks like this was to either wipe the disk and reformat using MBR, or else ignore it entirely and install a second disk for OS 2. Fortunately, with ArcaOS 5.1, GPT support will be a reality. Not only can we take advantage of the points that you see listed on the bottom half of this slide, but our new GPT driver basically eliminates the problems listed on the top half of this slide as well. So, best of both worlds in a sense. So, how does our GPT support work? We have what's called a filter driver that talks to the AHCI or NVMe storage controller drivers. This filter reads the attached hard drives and it understands the GPT disk layout. Then it performs real-time translation to present GPT partitions to the OS 2 storage management subsystem so that they look like MBR formatted disks to the operating system. In technical terms, when you create a GPT partition for use with ArcaOS, it's assigned the GUID, which is a universal partition type identifier, that's been designated for ArcaOS. The filter driver recognizes these partitions and presents them to OS 2 as individual MBR style hard disks. Now, this translation is done in memory, so the underlying physical hard disk is still GPT formatted. These partitions are mounted automatically, and the assigned drive letter will be the same across all installations. Now, other non-OS 2 GPT partitions can also be mounted by assigning them drive letters. These drive letters are installation specific, meaning if you take the disk out of if you have multiple OS 2 installed on the same system, the drive letter assignments for the non-OS 2 partitions aren't guaranteed to carry over. Now, partitions of any type can be mounted or unmounted at any time by assigning or removing the drive letters, and this is persistent across reboots. Now, over the past few months, we've updated the installation and partition management tools to handle GPT disks seamlessly. So, the normal installation volume manager now supports GPT disks, which means that special tool PTE that I showed back in my demonstration this past spring is no longer needed. So it's much more seamless and very easy to use, I have to say, having tried it out a few times myself, as you would probably imagine. So using GPT on ArcaOS provides the following benefits. Among others, there's no need to wipe and reformat the preloaded Windows, most likely, hard disk on new computers. You can simply install ArcaOS next to it, assuming, of course, that you can resize the Windows partition to make the space available. And there are no more frustrating disk geometry errors in LVM. ArcaOS will no longer complain about certain disk and partitioning issues that you may encounter with MBR-style hard disks when you're using GPT hard disks. And this is a particularly nice one. You can use hard disks larger than 2 terabytes with ArcaOS and actually use that space. Now, you can also use other GPT partitioning tools or disk imaging tools, for example, those belonging to other operating systems, because they'll simply see the ArcaOS GPT partitions like any other GPT partitions, which means we are finally also moving away from this long-standing restriction where you always have to partition your disks for OS2 using OS2 tools. You're much more free to use other tools now, because they're all GPT and they operate on that level. And ArcaOS itself doesn't care about the GPT disk geometry on the physical level because the filter driver handles it all. So, as I say, it's surprisingly painless, much more so in many ways than working with the traditional partition layout. The biggest current limitation is that each GPT partition created for ArcaOS has a maximum size limit of 2 terabytes. Now, in order to use disk space under OS2, you need to assign it a drive letter, and there are up to 24 drive letters available for use, since A and B are reserved. So you can do the math. As I mentioned last time, with a maximum size of 2 terabytes, 2 times 24 volumes is 48 terabytes. So that is the effective upper limit of disk space on ArcaOS with GPT support. Of course, this was also true before, but with MBR disks, there wasn't much chance of even getting close to that limit. Anyway, 48 terabytes, maybe that's enough for now. Another restriction that we have at present is that USB and other removable disks are not currently supported for a GPT format. Now, installing ArcaOS with UEFI, when you go to install, the install media, both the ISO and the USB stick, they are and will remain dual boot. So you get one install image, you burn it to a CD or put it on a USB stick, and that will support both UEFI and BIOS systems. And it should boot up in whichever mode your system is currently tuned into. Now, once you've installed to the hard disk and you want to boot from the hard disk, this requires what's known as an Efi System Partition. Think of it as occupying a similar niche to the old boot manager partition. Like, it's not entirely the same, but it kind of helps if you think of it in a similar way. So you need one of these EFI system partitions, which basically controls the bootable volumes. If one already exists on your computer, it will be used. But if not, then the ArcaOS installer will be able to seamlessly create one for you. I should also underline that installing with UEFI does not require you to use GPT format hard disks. It is generally recommended, though. And your system may impose some other requirements to that effect. As I think I mentioned before, system manufacturers don't really tend to expect you to be using UEFI without GPT, so they may have made some assumptions that are baked into the hardware, but that's kind of system specific. But at any rate, in principle, installing with UEFI does not require GPT disks. So that concludes the talking portion of my presentation. So at this point, I'll pause the video for a moment and then I'll resume with a short demonstration of installing ArcaOS on a UEFI system with GPT disks. So, stand by. On a UEFI desktop PC, which has an Asus B450 Pro gaming motherboard with an AMD Ryzen 5 CPU and an NVMe Samsung SSD using GPT. So booting up, the first thing we do is go into the Efi Boot menu, where we can select the USB key with our ArcaOS preview build. And on the pre-boot menu, here you can see UEFI in the bottom right, which shows that we're running in UEFI mode. NVMe disk, Realtek NIC, Canada. There we go. And nothing else in the preboot menu really needs changing. So save, continue booting. And it starts up here. It's unpacking files in the memory disk. This can sometimes take a bit of time, especially if the USB stick is not the fastest in the world. For the time being, we've disabled the boot logo for booting the installer just to help with diagnostics. You'll see it when we boot off the hard disk. And yeah, you can see we're using test versions of the ACPI and USB drivers for this particular build. It's just starting. There we go. The installer opens once Presentation Manager starts, and this should look familiar to anyone who's installed ArcaOS before. The real magic is a little later. Don't think we need to change anything on this screen here. And the license agreement, of course. Speed read it. Everyone get all that? Yeah, so the volumes page, this is where things get a little different under the hood. So as usual, it runs the disk check program, but this here is now smart enough to detect GPT disks. And rather than looking for all of the problems that it had to check for in the old MBR style disks, what this checking process does is it enumerates the GPT disks and does a few things like verify that the filter driver is loaded and that the disks are writable. And then it will move on to the ESP partition check once it's finished this. As I mentioned earlier, you need an Efi System Partition in order to boot from UEFI. So it will check to make sure that one exists and create it if necessary. You'll get a little graphical pop-up that tells you that it's doing that in just a moment. Yeah, there. So generally you don't have to do anything here other than hit OK, although you can take a look at some more details if you really want to. Yeah, and the other big change is in the installation volume manager, which now seamlessly supports GPT disks. This functionality is largely under the hood. The GUI actually looks much the same as before, except that volume creation has a slightly different selection of partition types. These are GPT partition types that you can select from. We need to choose an ArcaOS Type 1 partition to install onto. We've actually created one already, so we don't need to create another one here. I'll just quickly show you the dialog. And the process is pretty much the same as always. Select the partition type, and then, so ArcaOS Type 1. Then proceed to choose a drive letter and a volume name. using drive C, so that's fine. And then we can just save and close to continue the install. So the rest of the screens look pretty much the same as ever. You might see a few new items in the hardware and software lists. But I think you all know what this basically looks like. So yeah, setting up the install on a GPT system is now pretty much the same process as on an MBR disk. You create the volume if necessary, select the target in the install GUI, make your other selections, and you're off to the races. So other than a few minor tweaks, the interface for GPT disks is largely the same now as it is for MBR style disks that you see on ArcaOS 5.0. And it automatically detects what kind of system you're installing onto and gives you the appropriate options. It really is that seamless. It's actually, as you can see, not all that dramatic to look at. And that's the big story here. I think dull and predictable is good. Nothing unusual to use. Nothing special to see here, folks. It's just that under the hood, it's installing onto a GPT disk on a UEFI system. And that is something that really we could barely have dreamed of 2 or 3 years ago. Anyway, so here the install is going to proceed as it usually does. I don't think there's any need to sit through all of this in real time, so I'll just pause this again and then resume maybe for phase 2. Okay, so we're well into phase 2 now, and yeah, this is installing cups, which is I think one of the last things that gets installed. And OpenJDK, I think this is just about the end of it. So in a moment we'll reboot into the installed system. There we go, finishing phase 2. And reboot. I skipped past this before, but you'll see that the UEFI operating system is now available on the system's UEFI boot menu. There it is, UEFI OS, Samsung SSD. And there's our full color boot logo. Isn't that nice? And it's really snappy to boot up on this modern hardware, I have to say. So here's our installed system. And I'll just quickly run through. I'll show you the screen settings. So in the screen object, this is another new feature over the last demo that I showed you. All of the available resolutions are now selectable in the screen object here. So it was a little awkward to deal with in my earlier previews. So the command prompts, windowed command prompt and full screen command prompt, they all work just as they always have. And it shouldn't be underestimated just how impressive it is to be able to get that working on a technical level. The DOS support is really quite an accomplishment. So full screen DOS, this MSD program basically shows the DOS configuration. Windowed session as well, ditto, same program. You can see it actually is loading the mouse driver by default now. Which should help for some full screen applications that need it maybe. And the same again for WinOS 2, so we've got the seamless session support. Again, being able to get this working was pretty impressive, I think. And of course, full screen as well. And this may not seem all that remarkable, but let me tell you, the lack of drama here, the lack of hassle in all of this is really, I think, something. Done. But it's done. Like I said, the lack of drama, the lack of hassle, the lack of anything kind of any weird steps or any unusual measures that you see or have to deal with when you're installing on a GPT and UEFI system. I think that's the real story here. It's just a functional ArcaOS OS2 system. And I think it's very impressive what our developers have managed to accomplish here. So anyway, that concludes the demonstration. Thank you for watching, and I think we may have time for some questions. Thanks again.
We're back with Alex and Neil here, and let's see some questions. Um, let's. IRC doesn't have any other questions, but there are some questions on the YouTube chat. Um, Here Ibrahim says or asks, is there any viable way to convert MBR to GPT for us as of yet? O sea, if there's a way to change the master boot record to GPT on ArcaOS?
Yeah, so the disk utility has a menu option, which is called, we changed the name of the menu option slightly, but it's called something along the lines of reinitialize disk layout. So if you open the disk utility from the system management menu, um, among the menus, there's an option to wipe and reinitialize the disk. And if you do that with the ArcaOS 5.1 UEFI support enabled, you will have an option to choose between MBR and GPT partitioning. Or, of course, you can use DFC to do it directly, as you prefer. So either way will work. Just be aware that it's a destructive operation, obviously. It wipes everything that's on your disk if you do that.
Okay, okay. And there was a little observation on the chat that they were asking if this was available now, and David replied that is for the future version of ArcaOS, right?
That's correct. This will be for ArcaOS 5.1. And I'll let other people from Arcanoa talk more about when you might expect that. But at the moment, this is not commercially available, but it will come in due time, hopefully sooner rather than later. As you can see, it's coming along pretty well, so it's already working quite smoothly.
Yes, and now there's another question about if there's going to be, or if if there are any plans to support VMware and the VMware tools. I'm guessing that he's asking this like a client, the client part of the VMware tools for ArcaOS.
Oh, I mean, I've run ArcaOS under VMware before. It certainly works. There's a couple of different ways you can do it, of course. There's the VMware Player or VMware Workstation, which runs on your client. That's kind of similar to the virtual box or virtual PC, where you install it on an operating system on your local PC, and you can install a VM there. There are some VMware tools, I believe, that are being worked on. I tried out a build that was available. I'm afraid I don't recall exactly where they came from, but I think there was an announcement on OS2 World that there were some VMware tools that supported mouse pointer integration and so on for running ArcaOS and probably OS2 in general under VMware Workstation or VMware Player. VMware ESXi, which is running VMs on a server remotely, that's slightly more complicated as far as these tools is concerned. I don't think these sort of preview tools support that yet. However, you can, of course, still run ArcaOS on VMware ESXi currently without mouse pointer integration. I do it. I have an ArcaOS VM on my ESXi server. It's ESXi 7 for that, by the way. So yeah, it works just fine as long as I don't mind clicking in the window to get the mouse and keyboard. But for VMware Player, VMware Workstation, yeah, there are VMware tools under development, I believe. That is not Arkanoa that's developing them, which is why I'm a bit fuzzy on the details, but you can certainly find it. As I say, I'm pretty sure there was a thread on os2world.com about it.
I kind of remember also that there was something, some VMware tools made and posted there, but well, I don't remember everything that gets posted there.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, as I said, I tried it briefly. It does seem to work quite well on VMware Workstation.
There is another thing. I think it's just a correction that Louis made to some question that that ArcaOS 5.1 is not that it's exclusive for UEFI or GPT. Like it's an optional feature, right?
Yeah, so I mean, it depends what your computer. I mean, your computer is going to be running in either UEFI mode or not, classical BIOS type mode. Depends on whether you've got the CSM enabled. When your computer is in EFI mode, basically all operating systems have to support EFI. So when you boot the ArcaOS install disk or install stick or whatever, it will automatically detect that you are running in UEFI mode, and it'll load the UEFI loader and go through it'll provide the support for UEFI when you install the system. If your computer is not running in UEFI mode, then you will still be able to install ArcaOS with the regular non-UEFI loader and so on. So it's basically the same install stick or install disk ISO as you download it, and it will choose whatever it needs to support your system when you boot it up. The install stick. If you have an installed system, it's slightly more complicated if you want to switch from UEFI to traditional BIOS after the fact, but I'm not going to get into the weeds on that.
Just one little question. There's there is a question about NVMe support, no SATA. If you can elaborate a little bit of how that is working and if it's working right now, yeah.
Well, I'll say two things. First of all, as you saw from my demo, I was installing onto an NVMe disk. And second, as David says in the comments here, wait for the driver's presentation. I'm sure he will be happy to provide more details on that.
Okay, that's good. And Neil, you have a question, right?
Right. I wondered if we'll have a boot manager provided for UEFI GPT systems.
I believe we're working on a fairly simple one, but I'm not directly involved in the development of that, so most of my information on that one is probably high level rather than detailed. But yeah, there's going to be a boot management solution that will be provided. I will say provided advisedly, rather than necessarily developed, although it might be that as well. Lewis might know more about that, but I think, in short, basically yes. It will probably be a very simple one, though. Oh yes, and as David says, a very simple one. And as well, you're not necessarily going to be required to use it if you have your own boot manager that you're already using. If you saw my presentation from earlier this year in the spring, we actually installed using Grub that was already installed on that box. And I believe there's also a way to configure the Windows boot manager to boot the ArcaOS partition. I have not done that myself, but I've heard from people who have done it, and apparently it's quite doable. So that's why I'm talking around a little bit about simply saying yes or no to we will provide a boot manager. There will be one made available, but you won't necessarily be required to use it specifically, which is probably a step up from what the case has generally been in the past with OS2 and boot managers. But at any rate, Lewis is saying he'll talk a little bit about that more during the roadmap, so I'll leave it off there. One thing I do see in the YouTube chat here, as Lewis, yeah, somebody was asking about ESXi 6 and later. Yeah, I'm not sure. I've heard some people talk about issues with it. I have not seen those issues. As I say, I'm running ESXi 7 and I have an ArcaOS VM running on it just fine. So I'm not sure what problems other people have been having. That said, you may want to be somewhat careful about the hardware compatibility options that you choose when creating your VM. I think I use Workstation 11 compatibility level when I'm selecting that, but there's some information on the ArcaNoa wiki about recommended settings for creating a VM under ESXi or VMware for ArcaOS. So yeah. ESXi v6 has a memory RAM limitation. I don't know about that. I think I've got 3 or 4 gigs assigned to my VM, but again, and as I say, I'm not running ESXi 6. I'm running. I think it's. Hang on, what's the latest? I'm running whatever the latest is. I think it's 7, maybe it's 6. I'd have to look that up. But as I say, I haven't seen any specific issues with it myself.
Okay, I'm not sure if there's any more questions.
Yeah. Andy says he's having some issues with the volume on the stream. I can't say I'm having any problems with it, but maybe you guys can look at that if you feel. Oh, hold on. We've got a question here on the IRC. What is the future of Snap with UEFI? David might be able to answer that a bit better. I would say TBD. I mean, you don't really need Snap if you've got Panorama for UEFI. The only real advantage to Snap is accelerated hardware support for accelerated driver support 2D for specific hardware, and all of the hardware that supports is kind of years and years old anyway. So yeah, as David says, it works, but it basically you don't get any advantage out of using it because of the driver specific hardware specific drivers. Let's see. 5.1 allow the use of memory beyond 4 gigabytes for disk caching. I'm not sure what you mean by disk caching. Like we already allow the use of memory beyond 4 gigabytes as a RAM disk. If you can write OS level caches to your RAM disk or whatever as you see fit. I'm not quite sure what you're really asking about there, but as far as using memory beyond 4 gigabytes, basically for UEFI, it's going to be pretty much the same situation as it is for not UEFI at the moment. So you can use it using the PAE RAM disk support, unless there have been developments that I don't know about, but that's my understanding. Once 5.1 is out, will the installer be able to resize a partition in order to make room for an EFI partition? Good question. Generally speaking, well, the situation with EFI partitions is a bit different between MBR style disks and GPT disks. If you're installing onto an existing GPT disk, you would almost certainly have an EFI partition on that system already, and so you wouldn't need to do any resizing. If you're installing a new GPT disk, you probably haven't got partitions on it anyway, I would guess, in which case you can do that as it is. And the EFI partition doesn't necessarily, like, you need one EFI partition on your system. Like, I used the parallel with Boot Manager before. Like with Boot Manager, you only need one Boot Manager partition on your system. It doesn't have to be specifically on that one disk that you're using, on the specific hard disk that you're using. So with the ESP, I believe it's the same. You need to have an ESP on your system. And if you're booting a system in UEFI with GPT mode, you have to have one already if there's already an operating system that's running on that computer. And if you don't already have an operating system, then in all likelihood, you wouldn't have any partitions on that disk anyway, and you wouldn't need to resize, if you kind of see what I'm getting at. Clear as mud?
As clear
you
as
can also
can
use, I should say you can also use external tools to resize partitions quite easily now with the GPT support. Because with the GPT support, as I mentioned, OS2 really no longer cares about the disk geometry. So you can use the Windows partition resizer if you want. It's built into Windows, for example, or whatever there's something available for Linux that's kind of like Partition Magic. I forget the name, but yeah, you can use that too, and so on. Okay, so if it's an MBR partition taking up a full disk, then you should be able to use the resizer that's already built into the ArcaOS installer to resize that, because we already have a resize tool in the ArcaOS installer that supports MBR disks, and you can access that from the disk utility. I believe you can access that from Mini LVM and or from the system management menu. And I think we are getting close to the end of time. Am I right?
Yes, we have like 5 minutes left, but if there is no more questions, there's no problem. We go to the standby logo, and then we go with the next presentation at well, it will be at 1 EST, right?
EDT.
EDT,
Yeah.
sorry. Okay.
Okay then. Well, everybody, thanks for your attention, and thanks for all of the questions. I'm glad to see there's so much interest.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. 50 users.
52 watching now. Very nice.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Alex.
Thank you. Have a good day, everyone. Enjoy the rest of Warpstock.
Thank you. And for the rest, just stand by a little bit, and we're going with the next presentation.